All right, here we go. We're back on. I think this thing's working. All right. So again, who's, verse 15, who's this God that I should obey? But that's what they're going to do. Something else I thought was maybe interesting. You think about the music, right? So when you hear this music, you got to bow down because instrumental music, that was one of the things that was often associated with idolatry, along with sexual immorality. There were some things that just always went with it. So maybe that's why God doesn't want us to do that. Just kind of a side note, maybe that's why he's opposed to that, to us having, I don't understand why it's wrong to have a piano in church. Well, because God didn't tell us to do that. But maybe that's why he doesn't want us to do it, because it was so often associated with idol worship. I don't know, just a thought, just we'll cover in passing. But so in verse 16, they say something interesting when he's trying to give him another chance, right? We're not careful to answer thee in this manner. And go, well, what does that mean? Well, the New King James says we have no need to answer. So maybe that's a little bit better translation. So in other words, they're just saying there's no need to discuss it. You can do what you're going to do. If you're going to burn us, okay, but we're not going to worship your false god. We're not going to betray God. Right? So there's no need for us to even talk about this. So again, you've got to admire their courage knowing what they were facing. They just flat out refused to do it. Okay, verse 18, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. That's pretty plain, isn't it? We will not do it. You can threaten us all day long, but we will not do it. Okay? And they knew that God could save them, even if Nebuchadnezzar decides to kill them. God could save them from the fire if he chose to. Okay? Now, at this point, do they have a guarantee that God's going to do that? No. Okay? Just like us, think about all the apostles, right? Almost all of them were killed. God didn't save them from all the bad treatment, right? So God is not always going to protect us from physical harm. Depends on what his will is, right? But they're willing to accept. If God wants to spare us, he will. And if he doesn't want to spare us, then he won't. But either way, we're not going to betray him. Okay? And so again, that's true faithfulness and courage, and you have to admire that. And so they knew we're going to obey God rather than obey Nebuchadnezzar, because that's what it comes down. Either we're going to obey God or we're going to obey this man who's just a man like us. He may be a king and he may be rich and he may have all this power, but he's just a man. And we're going to obey God. Okay, Acts 5:29, Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. Okay, now, an interesting question that we don't know, because the Bible, did the other Jews that were in captivity, did they worship this image? We don't know, but I'm thinking probably, just to get along, go along, we'll do it, because some people think, well, I can do it. As long as I don't believe it in my heart, I can go through the but we're not told, so we don't really know. But there's no record of anybody else refusing other than these three. And the other officials only mentioned these three. They didn't say, hey, all these captives, none of them are, they just specifically mentioned these three. So that's what we know. But they are great examples. They refused to compromise, even to go along just to save their lives. They weren't going to do it. Because they knew there was something worse than losing their life. And what's that? Losing their soul. That's far worse, because that's forever. Right? So they understood that. And we're going to see, of course, God is going to bless them because of their steadfastness. So at this point, Nebuchadnezzar, he's upset because he thinks they're not showing any gratitude, and I've been good to them. And then he gives them another chance, and they still refuse. So at this point, as you can imagine, Nebuchadnezzar is going to lose his mind. Okay? He is livid that these guys would do this. And so notice in verse 19, the last part of the verse, and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it wont to be heated. Okay? Just the average fire is not good enough for these 3 guys. I want it 7 times hotter than you would normally make it. I mean, he is furious at them. Okay? Now, thinking about it logically, which he's not because he's really mad, which is another good lesson for us. Don't make decisions when you're emotional, because that typically doesn't go well. But think about that for a minute, though. If somebody was going to burn me alive and they decide, I'm going to make the fire 7 times hotter, is that better for me or worse? That's actually better for me, right? That will kill me faster. I'm grabbing the shovel. Yeah, I'll put the coal. Let's go. Let's get that thing heated, because if I'm going to step into it, I want to go like that. I don't want to slow roast. So he probably didn't think about that, right? But it would have been better for them to make it that much hotter. But it just shows you how mad he was and how emotional he was to do this. And so he tells them to do that, and then they throw them into the fire. Now, what happens to the guys that throw them into the fire? It killed them. Right? The other king's servants are going, boy, I'm glad I didn't get that assignment. Right? It killed them. No sign of remorse from Nebuchadnezzar. Oh, well, you know. But it kills the guys who throw them in, but not them. Right? So Nebuchadnezzar is watching this, which you'd have to be pretty sick to do that too, but we already know that. And he is astonished by what he sees. Okay? So he's not, apparently it looks like he's not really sure about what he's looking at. And so he's asking the guys around him, wait a minute, didn't we just put 3 guys in there? I could have sworn we just put 3 guys in there. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? We put 3 guys in there. And weren't they bound up? They were bound, right? Am I seeing things? No, we put 3 in there and they were bound up. What's he seeing? There's 4, and they're walking. They're not bound by the ropes. They're, maybe the fire burned the ropes off. Didn't burn them though, right? But they're walking around free as a bird with somebody else. So Nebuchadnezzar's like rubbing his eyes, going, "What am I looking at here? That can't be right." So who's in there with them? Yeah. Yeah. So who's in there with them? Most likely Christ. It doesn't say specifically, but most likely that's Jesus is in there with them. And Nebuchadnezzar's basically going to acknowledge that, right? Now, how did he know that? Well, we're not told how did he know that God was in there? Well, we're not told, but in verse 28, the king does call him an angel, that 4th man in there. He calls him an angel. But again, who could survive that? But the 3 men shouldn't have been able to survive it either. So the king tells them to come out. And so they do come out, but only 3 of them come out. What happened to the 4th one? Disappeared in the thin air, right? We're not told, but he didn't come out of the fire. Yeah, just vanished. And so notice that the king then calls them, he says, they are servants of the Most High God after they survive this. They're servants of the Most High God. Well, hot dog. Maybe he's finally got it. What do you think? Some of y'all are shaking your head no. Ye have little faith, I tell you. Maybe he's, or maybe not. One of those temporary things again. Right? But here's, as if it wasn't crazy enough that they survived the fire. Then when they come out of the fire, there is absolutely 0 evidence that they were ever in a fire. Anywhere near a fire. No evidence at all. Their clothes weren't burnt. They didn't even smell like fire. It's like they were perfectly like normal. Now, why did God spare them? Because as we've already seen, sometimes God's servants are not spared from death or physical punishment or whatever, but they were. Why did he do that? Well, some interesting things to think about. Maybe it's because the king challenged God's power. So that'd be a good reason for God to show him up and say, well, you think you're more powerful than me? The men that you got even close to the fire, they got burned up, but my men did not. So maybe that was it, because the king Nebuchadnezzar had challenged, who is this God that you think's going to save? He ain't going to save you. Well, he did. So maybe to show the king and the others. And when you think about when I say the others, how many witnesses were there to this? I mean, we don't know, but probably a lot. There were always a lot of people around the king and around the palace and in court, and, certainly dozens or maybe hundreds, or, and they all saw this. So again, put yourself, if you were there and you saw this, what would you do when you left the palace and went home? Honey, you're not going to believe what I saw today. Right? Can't wait to tell your wife and your kids and your neighbor and your dog and everybody, right? You won't believe what I just saw. So maybe that's another reason God did it, to get the word out. People are going to say, you know what? There is a God that is truly all-powerful, because you won't believe what he just did. So maybe that's why he did that too. Now, Daniel's explanation of the dream should have convinced the king. Maybe this would open his eyes a little bit more. Maybe. You would think the dream would have done it, and it did sort of, but then it didn't last very long. All right, verses 28 through 30. Now the good news is that Nebuchadnezzar now has a lot of respect for these three men, because he knows what we know in the fact that, boy, it took a lot of guts for those guys to walk into that fire. And they refused to obey, or they refused to disobey their God. That's impressive. Okay, the king then acknowledges the power of God. And he goes a step further. So remember when he made the big statue, he commanded everybody had to worship that statue. Now, he goes in a good direction, and he prescribes, he said, if you don't worship that statue, I'm going to burn you alive. Well, now he says, if anybody says anything bad about the God of these three men, the real God, if anybody says anything bad about God, they will be severely punished. So that's kind of a 180 from what he was doing. Well, how's he going to punish them? Well, he's not going to burn them alive. But this is pretty bad too. He says, you will be cut into pieces. I'll even burn your house to the ground. I will burn your house. And I'm going to cut you into little pieces. So that's a pretty gruesome death as well. Just for saying anything against God. Okay? And it would probably also mean better overall treatment for all the Jews that were there in captivity, most likely. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is it's clear that Nebuchadnezzar still doesn't get it. He acknowledges that God is more powerful than the other gods, but there are still other gods. He calls God the God of these three. In other words, it's their God. God is everybody's God. All right, so he still thinks there are others. And so these three men, they're promoted. And they get an even better job in the service of the king. So God continues to bless them. All right, chapter 4. Rolling right along, Reggie. All right, verses 1 through 3. Now, Nebuchadnezzar begins this chapter with a message from him to his people. And so of course, he's going to rule the Babylonian Empire for quite some time. It was an extensive area. But in this message, he tells all his people how great God is. And he calls him the high God. But again, the point is he still thinks there are lower gods. But he is acknowledging this God is the most powerful of them all. So he talks about the might of God. He talks about, again, that God's kingdom will be everlasting, which Daniel had told him, in the dream. So it sounds like maybe we're making progress, but hold your horses. Not quite yet. Verses 4 through 9. Now we see here the king has another dream. Okay, different than the first one that we talked about a while ago. Like the other dream, this one scares him quite a bit. It troubles him very much. And so once again, you think he'd have learned the first time. But again, he calls in all of his astrologers and magicians and, all the so-called wise men. He calls them in. Now this time, he remembers the dream. And he tells them what was in it. But they're still unable to interpret it. They can't really tell him what it means. Now, if you were Nebuchadnezzar at this point, what would you have done? Yeah, why didn't you call Daniel at the beginning, right? Just call Daniel in. He'll do it. But he didn't for whatever reason, but now he does. After the other guy says, we don't know what it means. So he calls Daniel in. And he calls Daniel, of course, by the Babylonian name that they have given him, Belteshazzar, or Belteshazzar. And we're going to see later, so it's important there that you see that T-E-S in there. That's, let's see, what verse, where's he calling that? Oh, verse 8, yeah. So notice Belteshazzar there in verse 8. B-E-L, and then there's a T-E in there. That's important. Okay, because we're going to see something very similar to that later. But this is Daniel's Babylonian name, Belteshazzar. Okay. And so the king says that this is based on the name of his God, which is named Bel, B-E-L, the first three letters. Okay, and remember, way back in chapter 1, we saw that scholars think that means Belteshazzar. It means Bel is my protector. That's what we think it means. They're not sure, but Bel, the false god Bel, is my protector. Now, there in verse 8 and again in verse 9, we see that the king speaks. He talks about Daniel having the spirit. If you'll notice there in verse 8, the spirit of the holy gods, plural, and little g, right? So again, he still believes in multiple gods. Now remember in chapter 2 that Daniel had asked Nebuchadnezzar not to kill the other wise men, because right, he was going to kill them all. And Daniel asked the king not to kill them. So apparently he didn't, or maybe he did. These are new ones. We're really not told. But again, my question would be, why is the king wasting his time asking them anything? Because they've proven they can't do it. Right? So the Bible doesn't say, so I'm not sure, but for whatever reason he did. I don't know why he didn't just ask Daniel at first, but anyway, it says Daniel was basically the last one to arrive, and maybe he'd been farther away or something, we're really not told. All right, verses 10 through 18. So the king now tells Daniel his dream. He told all the other guys, they couldn't answer it, didn't know what it was. So he says, there was a great tree in my dream. It reached all the way to heaven, just a massive tree. You could see it from miles and miles off, at great distances. You could see this tree. And the people, the animals, it's like everybody's needs were provided for by this tree. Whatever sustenance they needed, this tree provided for everything and everybody. Okay? So that's how the dream starts off. Now comes the scary part. Because you say, well, there's nothing too scary about a big tree, but someone called a watcher, which is probably an angel, says a watcher comes down from heaven. And the watcher, the angel, orders the tree to be cut down. And not just that. He says, I want the tree cut down. I want the limbs chopped off. I want the foliage stripped off of it. And all the fruit scattered. I mean, basically, you're going to completely destroy this tree. But he saves one thing. And that's the stump. So you're going to cut it off and destroy all that, but the stump, we're going to leave it there. And you're going to cover the stump with a band of iron and brass so that it doesn't deteriorate. The elements can't get to it. So it's going to preserve the stump. Okay, so pretty weird stuff. You go, okay, what in the world does that mean? Well, this dream, like again, God has sent it to him. It has a purpose. God has a purpose in everything, right? God, again, he's still trying to get the king to be humbled, to learn his power comes from God. And he's not learned that lesson yet. Okay? In fact, the power for any government, including in our time period, now they won't admit it any more than Nebuchadnezzar did, but the power for any government comes from where? It comes from God. Romans chapter 13. God established the idea of governments. All right? So something interesting. Look at verse 16. There in chapter 4. Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. Okay, so a couple of interesting things there. One thing about this, it's referring to the fact that King Nebuchadnezzar, he's going to be sent out to live with the animals. Okay, he didn't understand that yet, but that's what's going to happen. That's a reference to that. We'll see that when we get to Daniel's explanation. But that phrase there, 7 times pass over, that's an interesting thing. What does that mean? Well, I wish I could tell you for sure, because I looked at a lot of sources, and I mean a lot of biblical scholars spend a lot of time fussing and fighting over this, and they argue about it, and it means this. No, it doesn't. It means that, and so you get a lot of different opinions. So it's kind of hard to know for sure what this means. But we do often recognize the number 7 means something, which is what? Perfection or maturity, fullness, right? Complete. So it probably represents a certain period of time, maybe the time that it's going to take for Nebuchadnezzar to finally learn his lesson. That seems to be maybe the most probable, but I'm not telling you. Well, I know positively that's what it means, but it seems like that's probably what it is. It's a time period that God is going to specify that Nebuchadnezzar is going to have to go out and live with the animals for a certain period of time until he learns where his power comes from. Okay, so then in verses 19 through 27, we have Daniel explain the dream. He tells Nebuchadnezzar this is what this means. And something kind of interesting that notice in verse 19 says Daniel, and again you see his Belteshazzar, his name, was astonished for an hour. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a literal hour, but he was kind of shocked at this dream and what it means for Nebuchadnezzar, because of course God's going to tell him what it means. And so Daniel is kind of shocked at the calamity that's about to come down around Nebuchadnezzar. It's like, whoa, this is going to be bad. Because it's kind of a weird thing. What was Daniel's relationship with Nebuchadnezzar? Well, probably a pretty good one, right? I mean, Nebuchadnezzar, for the most part, was good to Daniel. He was hostile to a lot of other people. He was pretty good to Daniel. And remember that Jeremiah had prophesied, that God's using Daniel for this purpose. But he had told all of them, so when you get taken off into captivity, if you'll do something, you'll survive. What was it? What did Jeremiah tell them to do? If you'll just do this, you'll at least survive it. Obey. Serve them. Do what they tell you to do. Not when it violates God, but just in general. And Daniel had done that. He'd been a good servant to the king. So maybe Daniel had some kind of semi-respect for him. I mean, they had a working relationship, so he's just kind of shocked. Wow, this is going to be bad. Not that he didn't think he deserved it, but still, he maybe felt a little bit sorry for him. It's like, I'm trying to work on this guy, but apparently God's patience is running out, and the hammer is about to come down. So even Nebuchadnezzar could see, when Nebuchadnezzar tells Daniel the dream, and Daniel is really kind of astonished and troubled by that, so much so, there's no indication necessarily that Daniel said that, but the king saw it on his face. Right? So it might be like, if somebody's got some bad news to tell us, and it's really bad and they don't want to tell us, and sometimes you can kind of see it on their face and you're thinking, man, this is bad, isn't it? This is not going to be good. So apparently the king could kind of see that Daniel was disturbed by this dream. It's like, you're not going to like this. This is not going to be good. So the king figures it's bad, but he tells Daniel not to worry. He said, just tell me what it is. I'm assuming this is bad news, but just tell me what it is. Okay, so I guess he's kind of reassuring Daniel. Not that Daniel would have worried too much about it, but maybe he's reassuring Daniel, I don't care what the news is, I'm not going to kill you. I'm not going to punish you for it. Just feel free to tell me. Okay, because a lot of times they would. They'd kill the messenger. If the messenger brought a bad message, that's bad for the messenger. So, but Daniel basically says, well, what I'm about to tell you, said this is going to be something your enemies, Nebuchadnezzar, they will celebrate this. It ain't going to make you happy, but it's sure going to make them happy. So Nebuchadnezzar knows, okay, this is going to be bad. So in the dream, Nebuchadnezzar is the tree. So already, without saying anything else, what do you know? The tree's going to be cut down. Right there. Okay. He probably was tempted, okay, forget the rest of it. This is already really bad. I was hoping somebody else was the tree, but I'm the tree, right? Yeah, so he's the tree. Now, he had grown big and strong. Again, this is a tree you could see for miles and miles. So this great empire that he controlled, right? But Daniel says, you're going to be cut down. You're going to be punished. You're going to be humbled. Because that's what I've been trying to do with you the whole time. I've been trying to show you your power comes from God. You need some humility, but it hasn't worked. And so now you're going to get it. One way or another, you're going to get it. So Daniel said, you're going to be cast out to live with the animals. And who's going to cast him out? God. Right. It's not going to be other men. It's not going to be his own people rebelling against him or anything like that. It's not going to be an enemy coming in from the outside. No. God is going to throw you out. Okay, and you're going to live with the animals. And you're going to have to stay out in the wild until you learn that God has power over all kings and all kingdoms, and that includes you and yours. And until you learn that lesson, you're going to have to stay out there. You know, and he's been trying to tell him that the whole time. And, you know, you've only got power, Nebuchadnezzar, because God allows you to have it. Well, now he's going to take it away from you. But, hey, not all bad. Hasn't been up to this point, but there's a little bit of good news. Remember the stump? And the angel, the watcher, said, we're going to preserve, we're not going to destroy, because you can kill the stump too, pull it out of the ground or what. But the stump was preserved. So that obviously means something. Well, Daniel told him, said, here's what that means. It means that you will not die. God's not going to kill you. You're going to have to go live out in the wilderness for a while with the animals, but you won't die. And because the stump is still there, it means you will be returned to your kingdom after you learn your lesson. So it's not, you're not going to get killed, and it's not a permanent exile. So it could be, it's bad, but it could be worse. Once you learn your lesson, God will let you come back and retake your kingdom. For a while, but we all know eventually the Medo-Persians are going to conquer them, so it's going to go down eventually. And so look at verse 27. Notice what Daniel tells him to do after he explains the dream. Wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee, and break off thy sins by righteousness, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility. So Daniel is telling him what you need to do. You need to stop sinning. What, Beth? Question? Verse 27. You need to stop sinning. You need to show mercy to the poor, mercy to all those people below you, which is pretty much everybody. Because you have no chance without that. You've got to do that. Okay? Well, if he sinned, now wait a minute, he's not Jewish, he's not in the law of Moses, but yet God says he's a sinner, so what did that mean for the non-Jews? They had a law of God too, just wasn't the law of Moses. Right? They had a standard that God had given them that they were supposed to live by. Nebuchadnezzar obviously wasn't doing that. So, but learning his lesson, like ours, it required repentance. Daniel's telling him, you've got to repent of what you've done. All right, verses 28 through 30. So in this section, we see that the dream is fulfilled. Of course, we knew it would be, because God said it's going to happen. So, but it's not going to be fulfilled immediately. So we see that a year passes, 12 months, and seemingly one of two things happen. Either the king, and we do know over time, we tend to forget things. Either the king forgot about this warning, or he decided to ignore it. And I'm not sure which, because it doesn't say, but one of the two. It had an impact on him early on, but then 12 months later, it's like, he's not concerned about it. How do we know? Well, Nebuchadnezzar begins to brag about how great he is. See, because he was saying, oh, how great God is, and he's an everlasting king. Now he's back to, I'm the man. Okay? Look how great I am. Verse 30, right? The king spake and said, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty, right? Look at all this stuff I've built. He'd created, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which was what? Anybody know? Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Built that for his wife. What a guy. So he's like, look at all this I've done. Daniel must have been thinking, did you not hear a word I said? But no, apparently not. Didn't sink in. Sank in temporarily, but very temporarily. Right? So he's bragging about how he built it and how powerful he is. And if you read the secular descriptions of Babylon, it was a magnificent city. And Nebuchadnezzar was known as a great builder. But again, it's because God allowed him. God had blessed him and allowed him to do that. So the king is full of pride. And we all know Proverbs 16:18, pride goeth before destruction. Well, it did in this case, because he's about to get the destruction part. So now, look at verse 31. I wonder, when he starts bragging, how long does God wait? While the word was in the king's mouth. He hadn't even got through bragging about how great he was. I'm this, I'm that. God said, excuse me, you're done. He didn't even wait for him to get through bragging about it. Either God or an angel tells him from above, you've lost your kingdom, and he's driven out at that moment. And so we see, you read on, he's going to go, and he's going to basically live like a wild animal. Talks about his fingernails grow long, he's got hair everywhere, he's just nasty, and just living like an animal. And this guy's been the king over the greatest empire at the time, with the best house, the best clothes, the best food, and now he's worse than the poorest person in his kingdom. And there are some, we're not going to speculate too much on it, some doctors who have interestingly, they have some theories about maybe that Nebuchadnezzar even went temporarily insane and believed he was an animal, and the Bible doesn't say specifically, but it's possible. Now, the critics of all this, they will point out that they kind of scoff at this part of the story, because Nebuchadnezzar, obviously, he's a historical figure. He's a real person. Babylon was real. Got a lot of records, And so you get to this part of it, so, the Bible's just, it's a lie. It's not true. So, we got all these historical records about Nebuchadnezzar. We don't read one single thing about him going out and living like an animal. There's nothing in the record about him doing that. So a lot of other stuff that, maybe the Bible coincides with, but this right here proves the Bible is false. Okay, and they'll say that and they'll believe that, because you don't read anything about this. And this was a pretty big event in Nebuchadnezzar's life. You think they'd record it. Would they? Right? We all have things in our life, or well, maybe I shouldn't say all, but a lot of us do, have things in our life that we're not proud of and bad episodes in our life. And if somebody was writing a book about us for posterity, would we be tempted to not put that in there? Especially if I'm writing an autobiography. If I'm writing it, I'm going to put all my faults in there? Probably not, unless Janice makes me. Right? I'm going to just leave that part out. That's not one of my better moments there. We don't really have to talk about that. Right? And who's writing the historical record? Nebuchadnezzar. The secular historical record. Yeah, God wrote the Bible. But who's the record of Nebuchadnezzar? Who's writing it? He is. So you think he might leave that part out? I'd say he would. Right? So well, that proves it didn't happen. That proves no such thing. It just proves he didn't want to talk about it. Right? So I have no trouble believing that, because there's a lot of people that write books about themselves, and then you research other things, and you find they left out some things that left them in a less than flattering light. We'd all be tempted to do that. So I have no problem believing, Nebuchadnezzar would not have wanted any of that to be written down because it's not one of his best moments, okay? Do you know of any political ruler that has a monument built to his most embarrassing moment? Because I don't, right? So yeah, he's probably not going to have that chiseled into the walls or any of that kind of thing. So they're going to sweep those things under the rug, and I would say in Nebuchadnezzar that's probably what he did here. Okay? Why would he be any different than anybody else? All right, verses 34 through 37. Well, finally, after being out there for a while, again, that 7 times Passover, however long that was, the king repents. He finally learns his lesson. Okay? And we should have known that he would. How would we know that? You say, what if he doesn't repent? Well, we knew that he would. How? God already said, you're going to come back and get your kingdom back. So God knew he would repent at some point, but he needed to be brought down low to get him to do that. Okay? And there are probably times in a lot of people's lives where maybe God does something. You've got to be brought down low for you to understand where your place is and what God's place is and that sort of thing. So we knew he would. So he gets past this insanity, and he'd finally learn some valuable lessons about God. Okay? So as we read this, what does he learn? Well, number one, he finally does learn that God rules over everything. God rules over everything. Whose kingdom is the only one that's everlasting? God's is, right? Is Nebuchadnezzar's everlasting? No, it's been long gone, right? So he learns that. God rules over everything. Number two, all men, including himself, are nothing compared to God. So that was a bitter pill for him to swallow. But he finally comes to realize that he is nothing without God. Number three, he figures out that God is righteous, God is truthful, and he is just. And then number four, which he had to learn the hard way, God will punish the proud and give grace to the humble. Okay, we're not going to go read it, but 1 Peter 5, verses 5 and 6, God will punish the proud, but he will give grace to the humble. So those are the things that Nebuchadnezzar, he had to learn them the hard way, but he learned them. All right, chapter 5. All right, we need a little bit of historical background because when we get to chapter 5, there's a gap in time. And for history nerds like me, it drives us crazy, but again, God knows what he's doing. But there's a gap in time between the end of chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5. Okay, so I felt like I probably need to explain this a little bit so that we kind of understand what we're looking at. Because if you just read it and then you don't know all the background information, then it can get a little bit confusing. Okay, so the historical record tells us that Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC. 562 BC, Nebuchadnezzar dies. Now, over the next few years, there'll be several rulers that will take his place, that will be the new king of Babylon. But we want to get to one called Nabonidus. And he takes over in 556. So, 6, 7 years after Nebuchadnezzar dies. Up there. Yeah, Nabonidus. Now, Nabonidus is the father of Belshazzar. I go, what? But that's Daniel's name, right? No, remember I told you, right? B-E-L-T-E, Belteshazzar. Belteshazzar, that's Daniel's name. This is a different, that's why I pointed that out a few minutes ago, that you got to look carefully sometime which guy we're talking about, because it can be really confusing. It's just a couple letters difference. Okay? He is Belshazzar's father. So this guy, he's also going to be a king of Babylon. No. Well, I mean, yeah, he is. We're going to talk about that. Okay, so Belshazzar, not Belteshazzar, but Belshazzar, this is who chapter 5 is about. Okay, he's kind of the main character in chapter 5. But I want you to know this comes several years after Nebuchadnezzar, because then we're going to go back. Okay. Well, that's what I'm getting ready to talk about. So the events in this chapter take place about 538 BC. Yes, sir. Josh, you have a question, or are you just stretching? Okay, gotcha. 538 BC. So that's at least about 24 years after the events of chapter 4. So see, there's a pretty good gap here. So what we're going to see in this chapter, in chapter 5, for one thing, we're going to see the fall of Babylon to the Medo-Persians. Remember, Jeremiah had prophesied about that. Daniel said it was part of Nebuchadnezzar's first dream. And this was only about 50 years or so after they had destroyed Solomon's temple and Jerusalem, and So this is where it can kind of get confusing, right? So we're entering a part of Daniel that's not in chronological order. Okay? So I'm going to try to put it in chronological order for you, so that will kind of help you to understand what we're looking at, and then we'll close out with this. So chapter 7 is year 1 of Belshazzar. So to read about the beginning of his reign, we got to get to chapter 7. Chapter 8 in Daniel mentions it takes place in the 3rd year of Belshazzar's reign. Okay? So both of those are early in his reign. Now, chapter 5, which we're getting ready to look at, this takes place at the end of Belshazzar's reign, the end of his life. So even though we read about this first, these events actually come after what we see in chapter 7 and 8. Okay, and then in chapter 6, we're going to see what happens after Belshazzar's death. Okay. So really, in chronological order, it would be chapter 7, and then 8, and then 5, and then 6. That would be the chronological order. But it's out of order in the way it's written. All right, so that brings us to the beginning of chapter 5, so we're going to stop right there. We're out of time, so didn't quite get as far as I hoped, but we got pretty close to about where I thought we would be. So we're still in pretty good shape. A little bit behind, but not too far. So what that means for next week is you have your questions. What did I take up today? Chapter 1, right? So chapters 2, 3, and 4, those questions will be due next week. Okay, you also have 5 and 6, but obviously we hadn't got that, so you don't have to worry about that. But 2, 3, and 4 we'll take up next week. So thank you for your kind attention, and hope you guys have a good night. And